Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Tani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we have the latest on the Ukraine crisis, an update on the global COVID-19 situation, and we talk about whether the American National Football League actually thinks that Black Lives Matter. First up, the crisis in Ukraine is showing no real signs of letting up. We have news now that Ukraine has sought an urgent meeting with Russia within the next 48 hours. There was no weekend off on the diplomatic front, and hectic negotiations are on to de-escalate and take the world away from the prospect of war. Newsclick editor-in-chief Prabir Purkayastha is on studio right now to help us make sense of the situation. Prabir, first question, are we actually moving away from that prospect of war, like you said, which the US and the UK will have us believe is imminent?
Since they have never given us any evidence to show that war was or is imminent, therefore whether we are going towards war or away from war becomes rather difficult to answer. Now we also know that from what reports we are seeing, that the Ukrainian government has spent a huge amount of money in lobbying in the United States. In fact, the number of contacts that the Ukrainian lobbyists have made with the US decision makers, the journalists and so on, is 4 times that of Saudi Arabia, who are always the most active in the United States and have the biggest budget.
Right.
So how much of this is actually an attempt by Ukraine to game United States, how much of it is actually United States gaming the world, and of course the UK following suit, we really don't know. The question that has been raised time and again is the mobilization of Russian troops. As we have discussed earlier, they have a 2,000-kilometer border with Ukraine. 100,000 troops, to me, doesn't seem a very large number. And the pictures that have been used of tank formations, etc., are also with the military groups that are located in those areas. And as you have seen, if we make take the total picture, not the crop tank pictures alone, as is presented by the US media, then you would see it doesn't seem to be as fearsome as it is made out to be. Secondly, we are talking about now, for instance, the Black Sea naval ships exercises by Russia. Again, 6 ships are involved. In July last year, if I remember correctly, NATO had, again, in Black Sea, they held naval exercises. They had 30 ships. Russia didn't at the time scream there is an invasion of Crimea going to take place, with NATO being active in it and so on. So that doesn't seem to be also any indicator of impending invasion. And thirdly, if I may, if we take the deployment of Ukrainian troops, it doesn't seem they are particularly worried of invasion from Belarus and so on. It seems they're still focused on the Donetsk region, which is where they are head-to-head with the what they call the rebel sections, which are backed, according to them, by Russia. And of course, politically, they are backed by Russia. I think the essential issue is, what does Ukraine see itself? And does it see is as a Ukrainian nation in which those who speak Russian, who are ethnically Russians, they should be essentially second-class citizens, not allowed to use their language in public sphere. Their television studios and the radios should be shut down, which they have been quite a bit. So whether it's a multilinguistic state or not, is it a multi-ethnic state or not, is the question. And this is not unique to Ukraine. This has been there in other parts in Europe itself. Some countries are monolinguistic and monolithic in that sense, but a lot of them are not. For instance, if you take Belgium, for example, or you take Italy, there are parts of it which speak different languages, and they have that recognition, and it's guaranteed by their constitutions. So which direction does Ukraine move in? That's a key question, and there was the Minsk Accords, which had said it will be multi-ethnic and multilinguistic, and that's again come back on the agenda now with Ukraine seeking, as you said, discussions with Russia. Will that be back on the agenda? Will some movement take place on that direction? I think that's an important question.
Yeah. So, Prabir, on the sidelines of what the US is involved in and how maybe they are gaming or not gaming, the EU or members of the EU have been holding parallel conversations, France and Germany leading those conversations. What's happening on that front, and isn't that a more realistic sort of long-term plan towards achieving an end to this crisis?
You see, it is to be recognized as a European crisis, not as a NATO versus Russia crisis. If it is recognized as a European crisis, then it will be solved by European countries. The United States there is not a major player because it's not in Europe. But the point is, NATO being put in the forefront of this is also because post-Afghanistan, as we have discussed, the salience of NATO becomes a question. Is NATO something which all the countries feel allegiance to, or is it really the military front of the United States, which others then are camp followers? And I think that's an important question for Europe, particularly two major economies in Europe, Germany and France. And both of them do not think seceding economically from the larger Eurasian economy is a good idea. And particularly, therefore, the nuclear sanctions that they keep on talking about, SWIFT and so on, is not a good idea. And that's, I think, something which is slowly sinking in with Ukraine as well. So I think all of this war, drumming up for war, the US, the UK being really the most aggressive on this, is now beginning to impact the Ukrainian economy. Their currency has been falling, and the insurance rates for flights across Ukraine, or flights going to Ukraine or going away from Ukraine, are now rising. So a lot of the airlines are now stopping flights. This has a huge impact economically on Ukraine.
Trade-wise as well.
Trade-wise, a lot of their income comes from actually immigrant population which sends money back. So if all of that happens, Ukraine economy is going to be badly hurt. That's why they have not been raising a war scare for quite some time now. They've been trying to ratchet it down. And I think, therefore, when you talk about the Ukraine leadership now wanting to meet Russia, I think this is a welcome sign, because finally it's about the future of the Donbas region, and how this is to be resolved is something which France, Germany, Ukraine are the three parties who had come into the Minsk Accords, with Russia being on the sidelines but nevertheless being an influence. I think that should be brought center stage if this issue has to be resolved. The war scare, all of it is really US trying to get its leadership back after Afghanistan. I see it in that way, and therefore it is really not the central issue that as they are trying to make it out to be.
And let's hope the desperation doesn't win on that front, and better sense and actually involved parties can prevail over these forces.
That's a very important point you're making, because sometimes war can start by pure accident, which nobody wanted a war. And then, of course, a small little incident can suddenly spark a war. First World War, I keep on giving that reference.
Right. Thanks, Prabir, for that. I'll ask you to stick around, because up next we're talking about COVID-19 and the global situation. And Prabir has been, of course, looking at those numbers, as well as how the pandemic has been progressing and what governments have been doing to deal with it in various parts of the world. For this week, Prabir, what do the numbers tell us about how we are placed vis-a-vis the pandemic?
I think we are seeing the tail end of the pandemic in different parts of the world. That doesn't mean it's going down everywhere. The numbers are not going down everywhere. Some places they're still rising. But broadly, if you take the sum of all the countries in the world, that's not the way to really look at a pandemic, you would see that we are reaching the tail end of the Omicron wave. As I said, it's a sum of all the countries, all the regions, all the places in the world. And when you sum that up, then you see a certain pattern. But if you see it locally or even in a country, then you can see rise still in some of them. But broadly, we can say in most regions of the world, in the bigger countries like the United States, India, the numbers are falling in most parts of these countries. Of course, if you take European Union, also numbers are falling, but it doesn't mean all countries. For instance, Germany still seems to be going up a bit. But what we can see is that Omicron being also extremely infectious, it burns out much more quickly. It infects people much more rapidly, it burns out more quickly. So as long as the clusters are burnt out like this, either through vaccines or through infections, you will see Omicron slowly dying down, as we see now. But it doesn't mean, of course, that the danger is over, because all it means is now you see, as you see in Omicron, there is also the selective pressure on the organism, in this case the virus, to also evolve in a direction that it can escape vaccines, the immunity that we have. So both it is the immune escape part of the evolution, as well as it being more transmissible. Both of this we have seen in this particular case. Fortunately for us, we have not seen effect on the lung, the main impact for serious illnesses and death. That have been lower. So either because we already are partially immunized against the virus, and partially because of its own mutation did not make it more dangerous or made it less dangerous.
Right.
So all of this, fingers crossed, what happens, and as we keep on saying, all bets are off if you have a completely new variant that emerges, and it can, as we have seen, it can emerge from anywhere.
So on that sort of cautiously optimistic note, Prabir, governments are also starting to ease restrictions. Countries like Australia, which have been shut down pretty much for the last 2 years, are now going to open up back to international travelers. Local, of course, restrictions on schools, educational institutions, playing facilities, all of these are being eased. What we've seen, if I may, through the pandemic is governments putting across quite mixed messaging. So for you and I, who maybe need to go to work or school or college, how should we be viewing this from a public health and personal safety perspective as well?
Well, let's put it this way. There is no private safety in the virus.
Yeah.
What we're really looking at is the public safety. And if public safety is ensured, then we are also safe relatively. Now, if we look at that, it's clear that we have to balance against conflicting interests.
Right.
You have the interest of the small children who have been denied of schools for now almost 2 years, and a huge impact on their learning. Let's put it this way. For the sections which need education most are the sections which have been hit the hardest. The sections that need government support, need public support, they are the sections which have been hit the hardest. The poor has been hit the hardest. So obviously we have to take that into account when you talk about what policies now need to be followed. It's not a 1, 2 month, 3 month issue. So I think that needs to be taken into account, and it has to be realistic. Unfortunately, even when you take, for instance, countries like India, we tend to move in administrative units, not in local terms. And we tend to move in police outlook rather than a public health outlook.
Right.
Things like curfew, dawn to dusk, dusk to dawn curfews. These doesn't make any weekend lockdown. This makes no sense really. So I think we have to make the systems which appear reasonable to people and take that into consideration when we create these policies. And it is really outreach as well as involvement of the people that has been missing in different parts of the world. That is the reason also its unpopularity, because then people see it as alien and something they chafe against instead of something they're participating in. And then that would make a huge difference. And this has to be also local, as we've discussed. This is not a global pandemic. It's not even a national pandemic. These are all local clusters, local areas. So that also has to be kept in mind instead of clamping down states or across what seems to be convenient administrative units, policies which are really not something which is conducive to public health. I think all of this is now creating a pushback, some combining with anti-vaxxers, some combining with people who are really anti-state and have been so. But nevertheless, there is also this element of what we have to see as why there is this now both tiredness about the pandemic restrictions and also pushback.
Right. Thanks, Praveen. We hope to have you back on Daily Debrief with another update next Monday on how things are going. Right. And finally, the weekend is when there's a whole ton of sports action on pitches around the world. This one was no exception. From the Winter Olympics, which are of course on in Beijing, to the Super Bowl in the United States. I spoke to NewsClick Sports Desk for some insight into what's going on behind the glitz and glamour, or maybe the smoke and mirrors, of what was Super Bowl 56.
Right, so Vaibhav, thanks for taking the time out to join us on Daily Debrief today. You are not just a voracious consumer of Twitter, but also that of pop culture. So take us through, firstly, what went down at the Super Bowl yesterday in terms of some icons from the rap music industry being there, and what was the kind of conversation that happened around it?
Well, to be clear, first of all, I just want to say that my only involvement with pop culture is literally, and the only involvement of sport with pop culture is the Super Bowl halftime show. It's 12 minutes of melodrama. And yes, this Super Bowl's halftime show was always going to be a big deal, simply because in 2016, if you remember, there were a lot of high-profile stars like Rihanna, Adele, Cardi B, who had boycotted the show. They said they're not going to perform because of Colin Kaepernick and the NFL not doing enough in support of and to combat racism. And at that point in time, they got Maroon 5, which, let's be honest, is nobody's first choice at anything. All right. So, but in a huge move since then, like Jay-Z's production house has taken over this halftime show for the NFL. They're the guys who do it. So this year it was like, if you grew up in the 90s, then this was like some sort of bizarre dream, because you had Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Eminem, Mary J. Blige, and then you had the new generation, Anderson .Paak and Kendrick Lamar. They all came on stage to do this like outstanding show. And one of the, obviously, like one of the big things about it was that you have so many Black artists performing. And would they say something? Like, would there be some sort of statement made talking about like Black Lives Matter, or about, generally the NFL has been very unreceptive to these sort of statements. The Colin Kaepernick, for example, is still basically blacklisted from NFL teams across the board. So it was a massive show. It was like, in terms of music, it was sensational. Because I mean, I don't know, for me, the greatest R&B singer of all time, the most awarded R&B singer of all time, and then on top of that, there was Eminem. I was basically a teenager for a long while today. And yeah, I mean, they did. So
also as a conversation starter, yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry,
so yeah, so someone like Kendrick Lamar, for example, everyone was, everyone was talking about how Kendrick Lamar's music and his lyrics are essentially a lot to do with discrimination and a lot to do with like inequality. And so everyone was wondering if he would be allowed to do all of that. In the lead up, there had been questions and there were rumors floating that Eminem had said that he was going to take the knee, and the NFL had asked him not to do it. Dr. Dre's, some of his songs were being censored, and Dr. Dre was, of course, part of NWA, if you remember, and they were one of the first rap bands to really come out and like powerfully say something against the police in a legendary number that perhaps is, you can just go and look that up. So there was all of this happening. But to be fair, to a certain degree, like Kendrick Lamar's song, All Right, he did perform it, and there seemed to be no censorship. Eminem took the knee, and later on the NFL came out and said that, hey, we never asked anyone to stop doing it. So yeah, I mean, all in all, a huge moment for the movement, to say that, hey, we're a diverse league, we're a diverse sport, and we're willing to like acknowledge that. But also, I'm going to say just a little bit show busy.
Yeah, no doubt. It definitely is not just show busy, but very much big busy as well, with hundreds of millions of dollars riding on just this one
Absolutely.
game. That's of course part of, or the conclusion of a larger season at the NFL that is also trying to make inroads into different markets around the world. Which brings me to the next question, Vaibhav, and very quickly, if you can, because we're kind of running out of time on the show. This is a sport that is dominated by Black athletes. The vast majority of athletes who are involved at the professional level are Black athletes. Does the league care enough about these athletes, its players?
I don't think the league cares about its players at all. Yeah, like, I mean, we're talking about from simple like racism. They really never addressed this fully. Still, I mean, even today, there's a host of stars who have protested, have been sanctioned, have been silenced. All of this has gone on. The league does not care anything at all about brain damage that the sport causes to its players. The league does not care about domestic violence that a huge number of its players inflict upon their partners. I mean, there are so many things that this level of this sport, and I would say like this sport and this Super Bowl, just this event, is just a showcase of like what all can be wrong with the sport, and still people allow it to succeed because the showcase is way more than anything else. And I mean, even at the grassroots, the NFL is not doing anything to combat any of these things. So it's really like just a matter of drawing a curtain, a really beautiful curtain with a lot of lovely imagery on it over what is behind.
All right. Thanks so much, Vaibhav. Good to have you on Daily Debrief.
That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. From myself and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. For more on all of these stories, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back again, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.